My name is Patrick Melton. I am just to give you a little background about myself so you'll know who's up here speaking with you. I am a fifth-year seminary student at SMU Perkins School of Theology, and no, it should not take 5 years. I also work full-time as a Unix administrator in downtown Plano. That's UNIX administrator. For those of you who may have misheard that, Unix administrator. Okay, I work as a computer geek in downtown Plano. I also work as a part-time job as our youth director at FUMC Heath. And that is where many, many moons ago I met the Reverend Reed Fade. One of the many things that I learned from Reed Fade, one of the three things that I learned from Reed Fade was a great analogy about why she loves the Methodist denomination. As you can imagine, we were in a fairly heated discussion at the time. It was one of the disciple classes, I don't remember which one, but it pretty much devolved into a heated discussion at every one of them. And she presented this analogy to me that interpretation of the Christian faith is an awful lot like a baseball diamond. You can be far left field or far right field on just about any subject, and you're both still in bounds. Now, there are out of bounds, but you can be pretty far away from each other and still both be in bounds. The understanding of beliefs are varied among us, but we're all still on the same team. Now, I can let you guess which one of us was far left field and which one of us was far right field and be less than subtle in y'all's guessing. For me and for both Reed and I in this particular circumstance, that analogy worked perfectly for us to be able to understand that even though we were really far apart from each other on this, we were both still playing on the same team. I love analogies and metaphors. I love similes, I love parables, I love fables. And to be fair, I have a degree in English literature. My mother has a master's degree in English, and I'm kind of predisposed towards the English language. But there's a reason why Jesus used analogies, parables, in order to teach to people. It's because they work. It allows us to see the same subject, the same concept, from a different point of view. It allows us to see something that we thought we understood from a different perspective. Now, I'm not going to have this devolve into an English class, but I do want to give you a brief refresher course. An analogy is kind of like a simile in that both are a comparison of two things using like or as. A metaphor is different from a simile because you don't actually use like or as, you just say something is something else. And an analogy usually a parable usually uses an analogy to teach something. But the beauty of analogies are very much in the eye of the beholder. Okay? If you love the language, then analogies don't have to be flattering to the subject whatsoever. One of my favorite analogies is actually a visual analogy. Visual analogy of GPAs compared to tires. You can have a 4.0, that's great. Either way. 3.0, pretty good, not bad. My favorite is the 1.0. Either way, you're not going anywhere. I'm more of a verbal person. That one's for my wife. I'm more of a verbal person. My idea of a beautiful analogy that is not flattering to the subject would be something more like, her hair glistened in the rain like nose hair after a sneeze. Now, say it's not very flattering to the subject, but it is a beautiful analogy. Today's text from Hosea is very much like that. It's not very flattering to the subject, but it is a beautiful analogy. And if we can remove ourselves from the equation It is a breathtaking alternative way of viewing the love that God has for His people. I say we have to remove ourselves from the analogy because the story of Hosea and Gomer is actually a really hard text for many people. Read as a story, it is such a personal, relatable text, and it deals with such a difficult subject, that of infidelity. The personal pain and fear that's garnered just from the idea of infidelity can block our ability to see that this is actually a love story. And it's also an analogy for God's love for His people. Before we look at the analogy, though, let's look at the love story. I'm going to take a little poetic license here because when you read it out of Hosea, you get the analogy and the story mixed together continuously and it becomes kind of confusing. So, way back in around 3,000 years ago, around 950 BC, King Solomon is the king of all of the nation of Israel. And he has this general named Jeroboam. Now, Jeroboam thinks that he would probably make a slightly better king than King Solomon would. Solomon tends to disagree with him. So Jeroboam exiles himself to Egypt, where he lives until King Solomon dies. King Solomon passed away around 931 BC, and his son Rehoboam becomes the king, succeeds his father. Now, King Rehoboam calls together all of the tribes. All 12 tribes come together, but the 12 tribes have invited Jeroboam to come with them. Jeroboam comes out of his exile in Egypt, goes with the 12 tribal leaders, and meets with the new king Rehoboam. These 12 tribal leaders, along with Jeroboam, inform King Rehoboam that their taxes under Solomon have been just a little too high. Rehoboam is not necessarily the brightest tool in the shed, though. He listens to his young, new advisors, and he says, "You think my dad taxed you? I'm going to break you." To which the tribal leaders of Israel said, "To your tents, O Israel!" Or in modern-day parlance, "You see to your house, I'll see to mine." When the tax collectors of Rehoboam showed up with the 12 tribes, they stoned them to death. Not so subtle response. And of the 12 tribes of Israel, 10 of them split off. And they chose as their new king Jeroboam. Now, the 10 tribes that split off are now referred to as the northern tribe of Israel. The northern kingdom of Israel. And the southern kingdom of Israel keeps 2 tribes, Benjamin and Judah. The southern kingdom, which we now refer to as the Jewish people, refer to the northern kingdom for their new capital, where Jeroboam is enthroned, Samaria, and refer to them as Samaritans. We're going to get to them later in the story. The Samaritans, well, let's just put it this way. We'll flash forward about 200 years in which the northern tribe has been in a continuous downward spiral, not just religiously, but also morally. You see, while Jeroboam was off in Egypt, he started picking up some of the intermingling of religious practices. They're worshiping, as a northern tribe as a whole, is now worshiping the Canaanite fertility gods, in addition to the golden calf that was pulled from Egypt. And they're intermingling these with the worship of Yahweh. Now, there have been a lot of kings down through these 200 years, but conveniently, at the time when Hosea comes on the scene, 200 years later, is the reign of King Jeroboam II. Now, Hosea preaches during this time period, but Hosea is a prophet. Please keep in mind the difference between a prophet and a priest. A priest is someone who teaches people the actual text, usually from memory. Their concern is with the laws that are written in the Jewish faith. A prophet hears the word of God and speaks it to the people. This usually happens when God is ticked off with the people, that he feels the need to put a prophet up. So therefore, the people in power usually don't like the prophets all that much. But the message that Hosea is presenting is actually a message of God's love for his people. It's just tempered with the message that if we don't change our ways, we're going to start suffering the consequences of our own actions. This worshiping of other gods, this is infidelity to our God. Then God does something interesting. He speaks to Hosea, and we hear him in the first chapter, in the second verse. When the Lord spoke through Hosea, the Lord said to Hosea, "Go take for yourself a wife of whoredom, and have children of whoredom, for the land commits great whoredom by forsaking the Lord." So he went and took Gomer, daughter of Diblaim. Now, the identification of Gomer as a wife of whoredom and her children as the children of whoredom can be interpreted a couple of different ways. It could be that Gomer was already a temple prostitute towards the Canaanite gods. It could mean just that she was a member of the northern tribe who were practicing idolatry, therefore were adulterers to God, therefore were practicing whoredom in front of God. Or it could be simply that Gomer, as a woman, was predisposed to infidelity. We simply don't know. But what we do know beyond a shadow of a doubt is that Hosea probably could have picked a much safer wife if he had not listened to God. He doesn't. And at first, all seems to be going great in their relationship. Now, I can pretty much imagine this picture without too much difficulty. Here's this young prophet preaching the love of God in the midst of this degraded society that's morally corrupt. And this attractive young woman who has seen the way society has degraded is immediately enamored with him. She goes to him, they become married, they have their first child. A son is born to him. And then God literally tells him to name the child Jezreel. Now, Jezreel actually comes from two root words that actually mean, the first being sowing, as in sowing seeds, and the second one actually means a mighty, or specifically the Almighty. So if you put them together, they equal God will sow. What a beautiful beginning. And then it all starts going downhill rather quickly. Right after Jezreel is born, Hosea starts to notice that Gomer is changing a little bit. Maybe she's spending a little more time at the Canaanite temples back in her old stomping grounds. Maybe she's just spending a little more time out. And he notices that whenever she does come home, she's a little distant and awkward. Then she bursts his bubble with this news. She's pregnant again. She gives birth in Hosea chapter 1, verse 6. She conceived again and bore a daughter. And then the Lord said to him, Hosea, "Name her Lo-ruhamah, for I will no longer have pity on the house of Israel or forgive them. But I will have pity on the house of Judah, and I will save them by the Lord their God. I will not save them by the bow or by the sword or by the war or by horses or by horsemen. I will save them by the Lord their God." So Gomer's daughter is born, and Hosea names her Lo-ruhamah. Lo meaning not, and ruhamah meaning having obtained mercy. Together they actually mean not having obtained mercy, or more simply, not pitied. Ladies, if you are married and your husband names your daughter not pitied, that might be a pretty good sign that things are not going real well. For Hosea and Gomer, it gets worse even faster. Hosea chapter 1, verse 8. When she had weaned Lo-ruhamah, she conceived and bore a son. And then the Lord said, name him Lo-ammi, for you are not my people, and I am not your God. Now, I love the specific detail that's in this particular verse. As soon as she weaned Lo-ruhamah, she conceived and bore a son. She conceived and bore a son. Not she conceived and bore him a son. Not she conceived and bore Hosea a son. Simply, she conceived and bore a son. And I'm not sure how the rest of the northern tribe was practicing the whole Israel Jewish purity laws, but she just weaned Lo-ruhamah, and now she's instantly pregnant. And I'm pretty sure that Hosea knew who was and wasn't the father. To add insult to injury, top it all off, God tells him specifically, name the boy Lo-ammi. Lo, again meaning not, and ammi meaning my people. Not my people. More simply, not mine. Now, ladies, if you're married and your husband decides to name your new son not mine, then you can pretty much bet the jig is up. The cat's out of the bag, it's running down the street, and it's on fire. Gomer has received this message very clearly. I'm sorry, I have this visual of, your family or friends showing up at your house. Oh, what a beautiful boy, what did you name him? Not mine. But here's the problem. Hosea still loves Gomer. Years actually go by after the birth of Lo-ammi. She's still out running around. He's still taking care of her, and he still loves her. He even loves the kids that he knows are not biologically his. In the beginning of chapter 2, Hosea actually tells his son Jezreel, the firstborn, to go out and tell their brother and sister that they then have to go tell their mother that she needs to start changing her ways. But what's interesting is that what he calls the two children. He tells Jezreel, go tell not Lo-ruhamah, but Rohamih and Ammi that mom needs to change her ways. Instead of calling them not pitied or not mine, he actually calls the children having received mercy and calls the son mine. But what is Gomer's response to this plea that she change her ways? Hosea chapter 2, verse 5. She said, I will go to my lovers, who give me my food and my water, my wool and my linen, my oil and my drink. Now you tell me, what do you think of our man Hosea right now? Poor guy. A doormat. He's a fool. He's a sap. I told the story to my 14-year-old son, and his first words and only words to me about Hosea were, he's just sad. As in a sad excuse for a man. I mean, so far, and I don't even understand this really, the most he's done is to be passive-aggressive in the naming of the children. He can even say, well, God told me to name them that. Okay? When he even corrects or tries to tell his wife to change her ways, he actually tells the kids to go tell her. He doesn't even confront her himself. I don't understand how he can still love a woman after all that she's done to him. How could he not get in her face, chunk her out of the house, and say, good riddance? Why on earth does he think that she's going to change her ways? And why does he even care? She's shamed him. She's made a fool out of him. She's cheated on him. She's betrayed him. And even when he finally grows a spine and decides that he's going to take some kind of action he does it out of love for Gomer. He's come to the realization that Hosea has come to the realization that by continuing to support Gomer, he's not actually loving her, he's enabling her. His overabundant love is actually preventing her from experiencing the repercussions of her own actions. And in order for him to actually help her, he must stop enabling her. The words in Hosea chapter 2, verse 8 are both words from Hosea to Gomer, as well as words from God to the nation of Israel. She has not acknowledged that I was the one who gave her the grain, the new wine and oil, who lavished on her the silver and the gold, which they used for Baal, the Canaanite fertility gods. Therefore I will take away my grain when it ripens, and my new wine when it is ready. I will take back my wool and my linen, intended to cover her nakedness. Suddenly, Gomer is confronted with the repercussions of her own actions. When Hosea finally cuts her off, stops enabling her, she no longer is the life of the party. She's no longer the one bringing the wine and the food. She can't even go home when the party's over because she doesn't have a home to go home to. No fancy clothes, no wine, no food, and pretty soon, no lovers, no friends. It doesn't take long for Gomer to hit rock bottom. And when she does hit rock bottom, well, she's a woman in 700 BC. It was possible for her to have her own money, but there weren't too many things that she could do to actually earn more money. So she does the only thing that a person of that time period can do when they're faced with utter starvation. She sells herself into slavery. She finds herself starving, chained to an auction block, about to be sold and become someone else's property. But I want to stop us right here as we start to feel for her. I want to stress, Gomer deserves where she is. She has been given chance after chance after chance to change her ways. And even at the end, even when she has reached the bottom, she's the one who chooses to sell herself into slavery. But who shows up at the auction? The one person whom she has wronged the most. Hosea chapter 3, verse 2. So I bought her for 15 shekels of silver and about a homer and a lethek of barley. Then I told her, you are to live with me many days. You must not be a prostitute or be intimate with any man, and I will live with you. Sounds an awful lot like, you shall have no other gods before me. Or, you shall be my people, and I will be your God. Now, before the women in this congregation stone me to death for being a misogynistic pig, I'd like to point out that the story of Gomer is very similar to a story that Jesus tells in Luke and in the other synoptic Gospels called the parable of the prodigal son. The big difference between the prodigal son parable and the true life of Hosea and Gomer is that the life of Hosea and Gomer, it's easy for us, no matter what gender we are, to place ourselves in the position of Hosea. We know what it feels like to be like that. What we gain from the lives of these two people that God has presented to us as a living analogy to His relationship with Israel and His relationship to us is that we can't imagine anyone loving someone that much. When we do, we think of that person as an idiot. I mean, let's be honest. If your son or your daughter or your brother or your sister were in the same type of relationship as Hosea and Gomer, what would you tell them? Are you kidding me? Dump her. Divorce him. I'll show up and for God's sake, we'll bury him in the backyard. But no. Gomer is at the auction. Modern day parlance, Gomer is in jail. Hosea shows up at the jail, pays the bill, pays off all of her indebted fees to the credit card companies, and takes her back home. In human terms, that's stupid love. In God's terms, that's humble love. And that is how our God loves us. Because in the end, in this story, we are Gomer. We are the selfish ones. We are the adulterers, the liars, the cheaters, the betrayers of our God. And we may try and justify it to ourselves and say, well, He's God. He forgives. That's what God does. But I want you to look at the analogies that God gives us in His Word. When you look at Gomer and Hosea, can't you understand Hosea's pain? Why does God give you that analogy where God is Hosea and we are Gomer, if He doesn't feel that? When you look at the analogy of the prodigal son, can you not imagine being the father who's just been dumped upon by his teenage kid, runs off with all his money and spends it on whoredom? Yeah, it hurts. And the ultimate expression of God's redemptive acts in the person of Jesus Christ, when He comes to us, we abuse Him, we strip Him, we beat Him, and we crucify Him in the most inglorious death that we can possibly imagine. Tell me God doesn't feel our selfishness, that God doesn't have some understanding of what it means to be betrayed. I like to finish every sermon with some type of challenge, and today's is a darn easy challenge. As we leave this place today, over lunch, while driving to work over the next week, at some point in time, I want us to think about this particular story. And I want us to put ourselves in the place of Gomer. How grateful should we be to our God? And what kind of change should that make in us? Amen.